Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Barnaby Powell. This is our third opportunity we've been given by the Chopsticks Club to present our new baby, which I hope is our best, our third book on China. And just to qualify what H.J. just said, we are not sinologists or experts in any sense. We are simply practitioners who've been out and done it. I'm actually married a Chinese, so I have something of an inside track. We are reflecting on our lives as practitioners and as bit part actors in the Chinese drama over the last 40 years. And our reflections have led us to choose this title at the present, China Goes Critical, 2018, because we want to show how such a critical point has been reached in China. There's now, as you're well aware, a rising chorus of dissent and demands for economic and political reform in China. So I should explain, as I say, we're not scholars, but we have made up our minds that there is a need to sound this particular note, to put the world on notice that although China is doing extremely well, we need to make common cause with them to make sure that their enterprise, their huge enterprise, is sustainable. So first we need basically, in retrospect, to examine the making of modern China. This was a useful exercise, how successive waves of foreign intervention have caused a series of shock waves in Chinese recent history over the last 150 years, going right back to the first British involvement with China from 1793, the embassy of Lord Macartney, which was way too early and was rebuffed, through the rather disgraceful period of the Opium Wars, on through the Taiping, which was obviously caused by the arrival of Western Christian missionaries, leading right up to the Boxer Rebellion, and then, of course, the great watershed, the great line break in the continuum of Chinese history in 1911 with the Xinhai Revolution. Now, what happened at that point was the mandate of heaven, which had obviously been lost or mislaid with the collapse of the empire and the imperial dynasty, was almost partially retrieved by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And his great experiment and attempt to introduce republicanism and democratic values to China was way ahead of its time, probably by about 100 years, because although he was a great champion of the sort of way forward that China needed, he couldn't take, obviously at that point, couldn't take the country with him. He relied on the urban middle classes, the rising professional and merchant classes for his support, which was simply not sufficient. So he was finally overwhelmed by the northern forces, the reactionary forces around the court, and very nobly conceded that to avoid civil war he would have to hand over power, which was very unfortunate for China. But it did lead to a period that we're all familiar with of lawlessness, the warlord period right through the 1920s. So what we see emerging is, as I said earlier, the series of shockwaves caused initially by foreign intervention and interference, which have had extraordinary effects in recent history and have come to the present head and critical period we're talking about. Now, if we look from the early 19th century, we see that clearly there was a groundswell emerging in China of a need to address the challenge from the West, and this took many forms. But after the 1911 revolution, since the attempt to introduce republican ideals to China, harnessed to the great modern ideas of science and democracy, was way ahead of its time and not suitable or appropriate. The Russian Revolution obviously had a huge impact and inspired the incipient sympathies of the fledgling Communist Party, which led to Mao Zedong basically applying communist ideas to China and adapting them in the form of realizing that any revolution or any real change could only be brought about by harnessing the energy and the spirit and the minds and hearts of the rural people rather than the city dwellers. And he, come 1949, at the end of the Second War, basically had a mandate, he had a very definite mandate. So you can see the swing in the picture you see on your tables, the swing between stability on the lower end of the chart and criticality was very much at the point of stability. Whereas it had been in the trough earlier of instability with the Civil War from 1927 onwards. And then, of course, the next phase, the next peak in the middle of the chart, was obviously reached, a stage of great crisis with the Cultural Revolution. Well, the problem in the Cultural Revolution is that Mao, obviously having promised to honor his agreement to hand over land to the peasants in China, the farmers, he then realized that this wasn't going to work in terms of raising the level of life, and basically had to revert to a system adopted by the Soviets of collective farms and communes, which was in many ways a sort of betrayal of the main promise that he'd given to the people. So basically what happened with the Cultural Revolution was huge internecine fighting, or what Alex has called intra-elite competition, which of course they were all trying to take each other out. And Mao, in order to sustain his position, unleashed this extraordinary dogs of chaos in the form of the Red Guards, and caused a period of profound instability, which of course led to another peak of criticality. Now, with his death, of course, it was a period of enormous uncertainty, and mercifully, Deng Xiaoping picked up the pieces and put China back on track by embracing the market economy to a certain extent, and freeing people up, freeing the energies of the Chinese people up to do what they do best, which is their own business. That was all well and good, and from about 1992 there was relative stability, another trough in the chart. However, a groundswell has been growing since the 90s of a feeling of a need, an urgent need, to address the business of political reform at the same time, alongside this extraordinary economic reform, which has been so effective over the last 20 years. Now, come 1998, China, as you see, weathered the Asian financial crisis enormously well, another period of great stability, basically reinforced by their accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001, which was a period, again, of great stability and great reconciliation with the rest of the world, showing that China could be compatible with Western norms, would go along for the interests of everybody. On Mao's death, Deng realized that he would have to be totally resolute, and although 1989, just to backtrack a bit, was a terrible tragedy of the Tiananmen massacre of students, he in many ways saw the need to hold China back from any approach to a Western form of government, because he realized the country simply wasn't ready, and therefore many of the younger people I've talked to have admitted this in as many words, which is surprising and very interesting. Now then, a decade later, from 2001, here we are at the present. Things are coming to a critical head with the lack of a corresponding attempt to reform politically. The spirit of we the people is beginning to assert itself, asking nothing more of the leadership at the moment than that they honor the Constitution, which enshrines basically freedom of speech and the press. As we've seen in the last week, there's this kerfuffle in Guangdong with the Southern Weekend paper, people striking for the first time, standing up to censorship. We all know the cat is out of the bag to a certain extent, because people have access to information, and people now have a voice. There will be a rising groundswell of popular demand for reforms towards something approaching a civil society. The waves that I spoke about earlier will become more frequent, the cycle will increase, each phase will hasten the progress of popular participation in China, we believe, progress towards a form of governance which must permit a growing degree of civil society. And I say this with some caution, if further revolution is to be averted. So that is basically our thesis. Now, how might this, what we could call a critical phase transition, how might this be achieved? Well, I leave it to my co-author, Alex Mackinnon, to outline the rather modest proposals that we've made to ease its passage. And Alex, I'll hand over to you now.
Right, I'll just change the mic for recording purposes. Okay, right. Like some casino sort of gambler here with all the recordings now. Just clip it in anywhere.
Anywhere, as near as you can to your mouth, I guess.
The nose. Okay, I guess that's recorded.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
What Barnaby has done is basically described the ebbs and flows in recent Chinese history over the last 150 odd years. Now, one of the problems that we're seeing in terms of the wave pattern that's coming out is not necessarily that it's going to repeat itself, but what's happening is there's been external triggers have actually caused the levels of instability to rise, and then this criticality occurs, and then they're resolved, and you get a period of stability. Now, what I'm going to do with this wonderful orange is demonstrate the difference between stable and unstable equilibrium. When you're in equilibrium, you're free to move. This is the population, this is the government control. You've got a good civil service, the population's free to wander about, the rule of law is there, and basically you want to be in equilibrium with your circumstances, because if you go over the edge, you're actually worse off. The problem I see in China is that on the wrong side of the saucer. Any change, the equilibrium fails, the population will move. And the only way when it's in unstable equilibrium to keep it there, when there's small fluctuations or when there's external shocks, is by force. And that's part of the problem we're seeing now in China, is that they're trying to get to here, where it's relatively stable, but it's been kept in that position. And what we want to see in terms of government change is what the government has put in place with the IMF. They're talking about bringing in structural reforms. They're talking about bringing in innovation. Going green is another area that they're looking at. They want fiscal change, which is a very good idea. And also they're looking at globally linking together for mutual benefit with other countries. Again, that's tremendous. But you're not going to get innovation without a change in the education system in China. The rote learning is going to be holding back innovation. You need critical thinking, which is not taught in the educational system there. You're going to also need, with the fiscal changes, you're going to have to resolve the banking crisis in China. That's going to be a big problem. There's various other areas in terms of health and welfare which they have to put in place. So all of these ideas are tremendous. They're talking about pushing them forward to 2030. I don't think it's going to happen by 2050 unless some other changes take place. The reason we feel that the cycle is moving back into instability is a thing called, it's not a thing, it's actually a theory. I should go back a little bit. You cannot take the present position and go forward with a prediction without a theory. Your theory could be what's happened in the past will happen in the future. That's not a problem. If you have got a theory, how are you going to develop it? Well, a fellow, an evolutionary biologist in America, has come up with some indicators for where social stability will occur and where it may not occur. A fellow called Turchin. We've applied these to the Chinese situation. The stability factors are straightforward. The first one is there a labor oversupply? That leads to instability if there's too much labor looking for work. Has the price of labor started to shoot up? That can lead to instability. What about health and welfare? Are the people being looked after in terms of health and welfare? It's got to be put into place. It's not there. The other area which is a problem is inequality of wealth. Now, there's an indicator for that in economics called the Gini coefficient. It's zooming up. China has got greater inequalities of wealth than the African nations and even the US, famous capitalist US. That is going to lead to periods of instability. Another critical factor which we see coming in is what's called, it wasn't my words, it was Professor Turchin's words, intra-elite conflict. Barnaby described how that happened in the Cultural Revolution and ended up with the dogs of chaos being let loose. If you look at Bo Xilai, if you look at what's happening in terms of China at the moment within the Communist Party, you are seeing intra-elite conflict. That is a dangerous indicator. The last indicator really is a question of what you would call socio-political stability. Are there riots? Yes, Wuhan was a riot. Are riots increasing? Yes. Are people dying in these riots? Yes. All of these indicators, they could be wrong. This is the whole point of a theory. The theory could be wrong. But they indicate at the moment that the period of instability is increasing. That means we're going to go into a critical phase. And why did we choose 5 years? Well, there's a 5-year plan at the moment. President Xi has got it in place. However, what he's got to do, we believe, is take those indicators and pacify them. That requires not democracy. We're not pushing democracy as a solution to that. What we're pushing for is a mandate from the people. Somehow, again, if we go back to the orange, if you can imagine the Guanxi system in the family, there's a security and a stability within that. It's actually, you don't really want to go over the edge. If we could see some of those connections coming through the people into the Communist Party of China, somehow getting through at different levels, then you've got an interconnection of networks, which will then allow the stability to be discussed, the indicators which I've indicated, which I've mentioned to you, to come together, and hopefully instead of being able to go towards criticality, where anything can happen, they'll actually come back into a form of stability. So we're actually pushing some form of mandate, saying unless President Xi turns around and develops a mandate with the people through network connections, we fear that that cycle of wave patterns which have been over history will happen again. Strangely enough, it's a 2 to 3 year generation gap. And I'm going to leave you with this thought. Go back 2 to 3 year generations, and you end up 1968, which was Cultural Revolution. So the pattern is there. You can prevent that pattern repeating itself, or you can allow it just to go through its phases. We believe preventing it from going through its phases again is essential, and therefore we are suggesting that China brings in those indicators as well as the proposals it's developed for towards 2030 and adapts for the future. That's all we're saying. Thank you very much.